Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy will affect your bottom line long after the presidential polls have closed. Now we have all the conventions done and dusted and behind us, so now the real work to the White House begins, or at least see who can mess up the least on the way to the White House. So this week we're going to be talking inflation. Will a Harris or Trump administration help or hinder the cooling inflation trend that we're currently seeing? Vice President Harris also released her economic plan for housing and tax credits as well. So we'll be getting into that. And to help us break down all of that, we'll be joined by Jared Seberg, Washington Research Group Managing Director of TD Cowen. But first, got to bring it back to my co-stars, Ben Werschel and Rick Newman, who, always following, always keeping us abreast, keeping us honest of all things going on the Capitol. So first, I want to start with Ben and your trusty note cards. Ben, what are you watching this week?
Yeah, so I've got two note cards for you this week. I've got inflation and debt. Sorry about the microphone there. As you mentioned, it's about sort of what we're learning about the macroeconomic effects of Harris and Trump. What effect they would have. I'll start on inflation for you. So the bottom line for folks, just to kind of level set this conversation, is that both sides are proposing ideas that would be inflationary, not deflationary. Trump especially. Trump has got ideas around tariffs, taxes, and immigration that could push up prices in the years ahead. The tariffs are the big one. Depending on which estimates you do, the full Trump approach to tariffs, 60% tariffs on China, 20% tariffs on everyone else, could lead to between $2,600 for a family or $3,900, depending on different estimates. So there's a cost there. And Harris, in a similar vein, is pushing on inflation. So she has effects that could be felt on price gouging. That has an unpredictable effect on prices. She's also projecting a tax credit for home buyers, people looking to buy houses that people are talking about could push up prices. I'm sure we'll get into that with Jared as well. So there's a lot of factors here that could push up inflation. The bottom line is that, according to Oxford Economics, Trump could push up inflation by 0.3 percentage points above what it would normally be, and Harris could be by 0.2 percentage points. So there is a push upwards in inflation. I think Rick's probably chomping to get in, so I'll let that, and we can get back to debt if you want.
I'm totally chomping because, Ben, you need a third note card that says stupid ideas on it. I mean, just to underscore what you just said, these two candidates are talking about how they're going to lower inflation, and the professional economists who are looking at what they say they want to do are saying, no, it's going to do the opposite. Their policies are actually going to make inflation worse. So, Ben, you and I have been writing about this. We've been going point by point through some of these plans. So I wrote down Kamala Harris's, what her big ideas seem to be, and then I put an X or a check mark next to it. I should adopt your note card format. So she wants to do something about food prices. People are calling it price fixing, but now she says, no, it's not exactly that. But nobody has a clue how the government can prevent price increases. Remember, we do have a free market economy here, so that's a dumb idea. She has this idea of $25,000 in free money for first-time home buyers who qualify. Almost every economist who looks at that says, well, all that's going to do is create more demand, and it's going to push home prices up, not down. And Ben, when you mentioned that Oxford economic analysis, the biggest inflation they found from Harris's plan was in housing. They said she would boost inflation by 5 percentage points. That's half a point. And by the way, those might sound small, but if the Federal Reserve detects, oh, wait, inflation isn't going down, it's going back up, guess what they have to do? Stop lowering interest rates, which they're going to start doing in the fall, and start raising them again. She is going to use antitrust probably to prevent mergers that might be anti-competitive. That I think she can do. If there's one interesting idea she has, it's find a way to create 3 million new homes, add 3 million new homes to the supply. But who knows how that might work. And then Trump, he says he's going to immediately lower car insurance premiums. There's no way he's going to do that. That's just complete fabrication. He's going to reduce electricity prices. He says he's going to cut energy prices by half. Guess what? There is no way Trump is going to do that. In fact, what's happening in the market for energy is electricity prices are going up. He wants to deport all these migrants. He says that's the way he's going to lower real estate prices. He's going to deport migrants. So there are going to be all these housing units where migrants are living right now that are suddenly going to be available to everybody else. I mean, migrants live 4 to a room, 8 to a room. I mean, they really tough it out. And somehow that plan doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. And then tariffs, as you point out, I mean, that is de facto inflation. So I find these so-called inflation fighting schemes, frankly, almost totally ridiculous.
So Ben, I want to get back to you then, because obviously if we've laid out the land here that both of these candidates, both of their administrations appear to be having inflationary ideas and policies, or at least broad themes, and they're sort of nitpicking at some of the kitchen table ideas here. When are their feet going to be held to the fire here, Ben, you think?
Well, I think that's the question, is whether it ever will be. I mean, inflation is going down. Inflation is cooling. The Fed says it's on its track for it. Or it's kind of on its way to the 2% target. So this could not be a major issue, and they could sort of have the freedom to enact some of these policies. The point you hear from the Trump folks all the time is that he did have 4 years where he raised tariffs like crazy, and we didn't have massive inflation. So there could be a way that in a kind of larger economy is not overheating with inflation, they can enact some of these things. So that's the question of whether they'd ever have to do it. I guess the larger question is whether these policies would contribute to the national debt, and then eventually they're going to have to sort of answer for that one way or the other.
Just to put some numbers on that, overall inflation right now is 2.9%, and if you just had 2.9% inflation without having been all the way up at 9%, I don't think anybody would really worry that much about it. And food inflation at the moment, groceries, it's only 1.1%.
Right.
So incomes are now growing by more than food prices. So consumers are regaining lost ground. Rents are going up by too much. I mean, rents are still up by 5.1% to year over year, and housing is up 4.4%. That is a legitimate problem, but that gets to a lot of problems that the federal government can't do much about. I mean, that's local zoning rules and things like that.
But does any of that really matter if, when people go to the grocery store, if they just don't feel like they're hearing about all this lowered inflation, but they're just not feeling it in their pocketbooks? How do candidates really get around that fact that the numbers are saying what they're saying, but people just aren't feeling it at home, Rick?
They don't. The candidates cannot get around that. I think Biden learned this lesson. They can't say, no, you're wrong. Inflation is not as bad as you think it is. They can't say that. And I think that's one of the reasons we're getting a bunch of what are frankly silly proposals. It is quite plausible that 6 months after the next president takes office, that people just are not that concerned about food inflation anymore, because they've caught up, they've kind of gotten used to the price increases, and the price of eggs, it hasn't gone up very much during the last year, or milk, or whatever it is. So people will get accustomed to new prices that settled in at higher levels. It's just going to take a while.
And so on that thought, I do want to put a pin in it for a second here, because we are going to be getting our thoughts from Jarrett Seberg on the other side of this break. So hold those thoughts and do stay with us here on Capital Gains. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We want to bring in Jarrett Seberg, TD Cowen Washington Research Group Managing Director, into the mix here to look at some of these inflationary things that we're seeing from the candidates, at least their proposals at the moment. So Jarrett, first to sort of set the scene here, want to talk about housing, the housing proposals, and what we might see, how that might affect the housing market. I know you're noted as saying that this will benefit homeowners at the expense of home buyers. Help us break that down.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think first, if we take a step back, right? I mean, why are we so focused on these housing proposals? Because for most of this election, it's the Seinfeld election. It's all about nothing, right? There's really very few substantive proposals from either candidate. We have some grandiose ideas, but not really the level of detail that we've come to expect, over the last, 25, 30 years in these presidential elections. And so when Vice President Harris actually puts out a housing plan that has concrete proposals in it, it's like, giving honey to bears. It's, suddenly a huge feast. And, we definitely have some concrete ideas in there. Her first-time buyer housing tax credit, I think that's dead in the water.
That's the $25,000, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's probably good for us because we probably all own homes, and, it's just going to drive up home values even more. But, when you have a supply crisis, encouraging demand, I mean, come on. I mean, we all know what's going to happen. And I really think that was included more because it's a Maxine Waters priority, and she could be the chair of the House Financial Services Committee again. rather than it's really a Harris priority. To me, her big priorities are all the proposals to encourage construction. And I think that actually could be helpful. And I think that could be anti-inflationary by boosting supply and bringing down housing costs.
Jared, could you just go into, I mean, there are a lot of different elements to that. And our audience is not going to be able to track all of it, but what could possibly work in terms of federal incentives to build more homes, which is a local thing? I mean, that doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. That happens in towns and cities. So how would that actually work, and like what is passable?
Sure. I mean, I think Harris recognizes that, despite some progressive desires, we're just not going to have the federal government go out and build housing. Right? That's not how our economy works.
Please, no.
No, right. I mean, maybe in the 50s and 60s, giant public housing projects, it's just not coming back. So instead, she relies on the low-income housing tax credit, which has been very successful for the last 25, 30 years in getting affordable rental housing built. And she's going to copy that to get affordable owner-occupied housing built. And the idea is simply to reduce the cost of funding for developers. So projects which aren't economically feasible at the price point that you need for entry-level housing, suddenly the numbers work. The other big idea she has is essentially an age-old Washington tradition. We've seen this so many times. And that's basically bribe local governments to improve their zoning, their land use rules, and to get more creative. Federal government did this. That's how they raised the drinking age at one point. We see this all the time. And she wants a giant pot of money available to communities that make it easier to build affordable housing.
Hey, Jared, what do you think about that last proposal towards zoning and regulations? I noticed that was one that wasn't directly as addressed other than that proposal you mentioned. How effective does that be, and how important is it that sort of the states and localities get that right for anything to work nationally?
It's the key to everything, right? You look at community after community, and it's not often that there isn't a desire for more housing. The problem is that the local rules just make it prohibitively costly to build what needs to be built. And so anything that can entice local governments, who frankly often are cash strapped, to make these changes really could do outside benefit.
Jared, I want to ask you about food prices. You've got something in one of your notes here that something was new to me. I had not thought about this. So Kamala Harris, like Joe Biden, a lot of people blame grocery chains and retailers for high food prices. Grocery store profit margins are like 1.5 to 2%. There's very little evidence that they've been doing any price gouging if you look at their profit margins. One thing that has happened there is labor costs have gone up by a lot. And that, people think, oh, that stinks. That means I have to pay more. But those are Americans who are getting paid more. So you point out that if this really does get serious and Kamala Harris tries to somehow go after prices in grocery stores, that this could become a fight about credit cards and this thing called the interchange fee. So can you explain in plain English where that might go?
Sure. So the interchange fee is essentially the cost that a merchant, a supermarket, your local drugstore, the local packy, that they pay every time you use a credit.
I got to interrupt you there. Are you from New England? The packy?
Of course.
Yeah,
come on.
That's the package store. Okay.
No sell things. You pay them.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I was sorry for the aside there.
Hey, I'm always happy to talk Boston sports, but so that's a fee. It gets paid, every time you use your credit card, and the merchants have been complaining about it for years. During the Dodd-Frank debate after the financial crisis, they were able to get debit card fees regulated, but credit card fees are still not regulated, and that means that credit card issuers are able to offer rewards on your card because they're able to pass those costs on to the merchant. So all those airline miles, those cash back, that all comes out of that interchange fee. And my concern is that the merchants are going to say, well, if you really want to control costs in the grocery store, then what you need to do is you need to control this cost that we have no power over. And if that's the case, I think, a fight that largely has been, between wonks and the weeds could really end up in the open and be something that's in play next year.
So, Jared, for voters who are sitting at home trying to sort of do the math on, as you mentioned, some policies that haven't been fully fleshed out by either candidate, how do they figure out which candidate's policies are best for them? What's the data they really should be looking at?
Well,
Great question.
I mean, I think the problem is we don't have data, right? I mean, that I think back, I don't want to completely age myself, but I mean, the first election that I really followed as a professional was George H.W. Bush. And in every election pretty much since then, we've had lots of detailed plans. We just don't have that. I mean, the closest we have on the Trump side is the Heritage Foundation's project, which he has disavowed. We have a platform on the Democratic side, which still, says that Joe Biden's running for president. They didn't update it when Harris became the nominee. So, we just don't have much detail. So what we have to do is fall back on their records. And we know that Trump is somebody who favors tariffs, but also tax cuts. While Harris is going to be much more mainstream, she's going to keep her hands off the Federal Reserve. So perhaps less risk of politicalization of interest rate policy, more likely to keep trade treaties in place. Those are really the framework to I think, evaluate these two candidates on business topics. And it's why I always call this the yes, but election. Yes, Trump may favor deregulation, but you get a lot of chaos. And yes, Harris may be in favor of more rules, but, she's also a more stable policy person. And so it's, good luck, everybody out there.
Well, what's the setup overall in Washington that you think is the best way to get this to Washington, get this right, Jared? On housing, we're talking about like all the ways this could go right and all the ways this could go wrong on the supply and demand side, and also the food prices. Is there a sort of layout with bringing in Congress and the race for Senate and House here that you think actually could lead lawmakers in the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. Divided government. I mean, everyone should just cross their fingers and hope that no matter who wins the White House, that the Senate goes Republican and the House goes Democratic. That's probably your best outcome. That gets some fiscal responsibility. Don't forget Trump, raised the debt by $8 trillion, and Biden's at $4 trillion. I mean, both parties are big spenders when they have full control. I think you get the most stable policy when nobody has full authority.
So, Jared, you said best outcome, economically, is split Congress, but you didn't say with who in the White House. You want to go that far?
Well,
I'll set it up this way. I think Kamala Harris would be way less disruptive. I mean, I think basically it'd just be a continuation of what we have right now. Stock markets are close to record highs. That nothing would change. With Trump, you would get tariffs. So that's my setup. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same page. I generally, part of my focus is the financial sector. I think the financial sector performs best when you have global stability. And I think you're more likely to have global stability on trade and tariffs with Harris than you are with Trump.
We appreciate you taking the time to join us. Fantastic chat there. Jared Seaberg from TD Cowen. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on
Thank you, Jared.
Games. So, Ben, I want to come to you first because obviously we're at this point where we still don't really have enough information where voters can decide who's better for their own personal economy. But then you have a lot of this sort of looking back, like, was I doing better now than how I was doing under Trump? Where are we in that discussion, you think, Ben?
Well, I think that this discussion is continuous. I mean, on the Democratic side, especially under Biden, a lot of Democrats I talked to, there was this kind of sense that will voters forget? That was the kind of the closest thing to a plan when it came to sort of how to deal with inflation. There is a lot of evidence that
Trump amnesia, yeah.
That sort of people forget that sort of people think about the last few weeks before the election, and that's how they vote versus the last 4 years. There's kind of mixed evidence on that when it comes to inflation. So that's kind of the Democratic plan, and then the Trump plan right now is, and they're having challenges with this, is to sort of just tie Kamala Harris as close as they can to the Biden record and say prices were up 20+% since Harris came in office. It's kind of a just search and replace Biden's name with Harris's and hope that people connect that. And although there's mixed evidence on how voters view that.
So I want to bring in Yahoo News correspondent Andrew Romano joining us with what he's seeing in the polls so far. So Andrew, what's really standing out to you as you look at this aggregate of polls out there?
I mean, the big thing that's standing out is just this huge surge in Democratic enthusiasm and optimism. It hasn't totally upended the head-to-head between Trump and Harris in our poll, which came out this week and was conducted entirely after the Democratic National Convention. We have Harris ahead of Trump by 1 percentage point, 47 to 46. Other polls have shown a slightly larger margin. It's somewhere in the 1, 2, 3, 4% range. And that's not a big difference from what we were seeing before the convention. When you ask Americans as a whole, who do they think has a better chance of winning the election in November? Now more say Kamala Harris than Donald Trump. Slightly more, but more. It's a huge shift from when Biden was in the race. He was trailing Trump on this metric by like 33 percentage points. So, we've seen a big vibe shift, and that's really driven by Democrats and their opinion of Harris, the changing opinion of Harris.
The double haters, where did they go?
Great question. We did see some shift to Harris in this group. So she's certainly doing better than Biden was, right? Because these were Biden haters and Trump haters. They weren't necessarily Harris haters. And her entry into the race as a new option, a new candidate, has given some of those double haters a home. Now, it hasn't, there's still people who have unfavorable views of both Harris and Trump, but the composition of that group has changed, right? Because some of the ones who had previously disliked Biden have shifted to Harris, and I think that's one big reason why you're seeing her with a lead in the polls as opposed to Biden, who was trailing. She's picked up, some RFK voters who didn't like Biden and didn't like Trump. She's picked up some undecideds who are those predominantly those double haters, and that's what's given her this bump.
Hey, Andrew, one other interesting dynamic you highlighted in your piece this week was a big movement in terms of favorability for Harris and less movement in terms of the horse race numbers. Curious kind of what you make of that too. Is that sort of people that were kind of Democrats who were hesitant to vote for Biden, but were going to do it, and now they're enthusiastic? And what does that mean for the election?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, right? Like Democrats weren't super enthused about Biden. They had issues. I mean, they were sticking with the team, and that's why the margin was still pretty small, right? Biden and Trump were statistically tied when he got out of the race, although Biden was behind a little bit. Now Harris is ahead a little bit. I think, again, that's because she's been picking up some of those undecideds, and it's because that image of her has changed. So in our poll, back when Harris entered the race, more Americans saw her unfavorably than favorably. That was about 11 points. So a majority of Americans, 51% unfavorable, 40% favorable. Now those numbers are level at 47%. It's a net shift of 11 points towards the vice president in a positive direction. It might not sound like a lot, 47, but when you look at Trump, it's 55 unfavorable to 42 favorable. Biden is similar, and those numbers really don't move. So to see a change like that so quickly is a pretty good indication that Harris has had at least a good first month in the campaign.
We'll certainly see. Still relatively early days. A lot can happen between now and November. Appreciate you breaking all of that down for us. Well, that does it for this edition of Capital Gains. A big thank you to Jarrett, to Andrew there, and of course to Rick and Ben. And from myself, Rochelle Akufo, great seeing you all, and we'll see you next time.